I don't even know where to start with this. Maybe it's because it's been years, and I've just been bottling it up, trying to pretend like everything's fine. But everything's not fine. So here I am, hoping that sharing my story might give me some clarity, or at least help someone else avoid ending up where I am. I met Sophie 8 years ago. She was, and still is, the most beautiful woman I've ever seen. She's a professional model, runway, print ads, even some big-name campaigns. I'll admit, when I first saw her, I didn't think I had a shot. I run a bike shop. I'm just an ordinary guy, greasy hands, old t-shirts, nothing fancy. But Sophie? She was this radiant, untouchable beauty who made every head turn when she walked into a room. To my surprise, she noticed me. She said she was tired of the flashy, shallow types she'd been dating and wanted something real. That was her exact word. Real. I guess I represented that for her. I was grounded, steady, and didn't care about her status or the glitz of her world. We started dating, and it was like living a dream. I felt like the luckiest guy alive. After 2 years, we got married. Everyone said we were an odd match, her with her glamorous career and me with my modest bike shop. But we made it work, or at least I thought we did. The cracks started showing about 3 years into our marriage. Sophie was always traveling for work, photo shoots in Paris, runway shows in Milan, events in New York. I knew what I signed up for, so I didn't complain, but she started coming home. Different. She'd be distant, distracted, and sometimes even short with me. When I'd ask about her trips, she'd give vague answers or brush me off, saying she was too tired to talk. At first, I thought it was just the stress of her job. Modeling isn't as glamorous as it looks, and I knew it could be exhausting. But then, little things started adding up. Late-night calls she'd step outside to take. Photos on social media where she was a little too cozy with certain male colleagues. And then there were the stories. The rumors I'd hear from mutual friends. Whispers about Sophie getting close to certain photographers or designers. I didn't want to believe it. I told myself it was just people being petty or jealous. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The first time I caught her was by accident. She'd left her laptop open on the kitchen counter, and a message popped up while I was making coffee. It was from some guy named Andre, a photographer she'd worked with on a campaign in Miami. The message read, "Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again." My heart dropped. I felt like the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. I confronted her that night, showing her the message and asking her point blank what was going on. At first she tried to deny it, but when I pressed, she broke down and admitted they'd had an affair. "I made a mistake," she said, tears streaming down her face. "It didn't mean anything, I swear. I was lonely and I let my guard down. But it's over and it'll never happen again. Please don't throw everything away because of one stupid mistake." I loved her so much. Maybe too much. So I forgave her. I wanted to believe her when she said it was a one-time thing. I wanted to believe we could move past it. I'd like to tell you that was the end of it, that Sophie kept her promise, and we moved on to build a stronger marriage. But that wouldn't be the truth. For a while, things seemed better. Sophie was more present, more attentive. She'd call me from her trips, send photos of her meals or sunsets from wherever she was. It felt like we were getting back on track, like the affair with Andre had been the wake-up call we both needed. But deep down, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that I was just waiting for the other shoe to drop. And eventually, it did. It happened about a year after the Andre incident. Sophie had gone to LA for a photo shoot. She was supposed to be gone for 3 days, but on the 4th day, she still wasn't home. I called her, and she said the shoot had been extended. Something about a last-minute project the team wanted to squeeze in. It sounded plausible, but there was something in her voice that didn't sit right with me. When she finally came home, she seemed different. Not guilty, but defiant. Like she was daring me to ask questions. And maybe I should have, but I didn't want to seem paranoid or controlling. So I let it slide. A week later, I found out the truth. One of her colleagues, someone I'd met at a dinner party once, sent me a message on Instagram. I'll never forget the words, "You deserve to know. Sophie's been seeing someone on her trips. It's not the first time." They attached a photo too. It was Sophie and some guy I didn't recognize, sitting at an outdoor cafe. They were holding hands, her head tilted toward him in a way that made my stomach churn. It wasn't just a fling. It looked intimate, like something deeper. This time I didn't wait. I showed Sophie the message and the photo as soon as she walked through the door. Her reaction was cold, almost dismissive. "You're seriously going to listen to gossip from some random person?" she scoffed. "You don't even know who sent that." "Don't lie to me, Sophie," I said, my voice shaking. "Just tell me the truth." She sighed, like she was annoyed I'd even brought it up. "Fine. Yes, I had a thing with him. But it's over. It was just a distraction, Mark. You don't understand the pressure I'm under, the way people in my industry treat me. Sometimes I need an escape." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "An escape?" I repeated. "You're married. I'm your husband. How can you do this to me?" "I love you," she said, and I could tell she meant it in her own twisted way. "But my world is different from yours. You don't get it, Mark." That's how it went, over and over again. Every time I caught her, she'd apologize, promise it wouldn't happen again, and for a while, things would get better. And every time I believed her, because I wanted to. I loved her too much to walk away. I told myself that maybe if I were more attentive, more understanding, she wouldn't feel the need to stray. I started trying to prove myself to her, buying her gifts, planning elaborate date nights, even offering to travel with her more. But it was never enough. Sophie was like a kite in the wind, always drifting, always chasing something I couldn't give her. After the second affair, I decided I couldn't just sit back and let this happen again. I had to fight for our marriage, for Sophie, for the life we'd built. Maybe it was foolish, but I was convinced that if I could just show her how much I loved her, how much I was willing to do to make her happy, she'd stop looking for something or someone else. I went all in. I started closing the shop earlier so I could spend more time with her when she was home. I surprised her with little things, flowers on a random Tuesday, her favorite dessert waiting in the fridge after a long day. I even started working out, trying to look more like the chiseled guys she worked with. It wasn't easy balancing all of this with running a business, but I told myself it would be worth it. For a while, it seemed to work. Sophie was warmer, more affectionate. She started including me in her world a little more, inviting me to her industry events and introducing me to her colleagues. I thought, maybe this is it. Maybe we've turned a corner. But deep down, I knew I was trying to compete with something I could never beat. It happened one night after an event in the city. Sophie had walked the runway for a high-end fashion show, and I was in the audience, watching her with a mix of pride and unease. She was stunning. There was no denying that. But the way she carried herself, the way people fawned over her backstage, made me feel like a stranger in her world. After the show, there was an after-party at some swanky rooftop bar. I was nursing a drink, trying to blend in, when I saw her across the room, talking to a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, well-dressed, the kind of guy who looked like he belonged in her world. They were laughing, their heads close together, and I felt that familiar knot in my stomach. When she finally came back to me, I asked, "Who was that guy?" Her smile faltered for just a second before she brushed it off. "Just a designer I worked with last year. Nothing to worry about." But it was something to worry about. I could see it in the way she avoided my eyes, the way she quickly changed the subject. That night, as we lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying the scene in my head. I wanted to confront her, but I was afraid of what she'd say, afraid that once again I'd hear the words I dreaded most. It happened again. The next morning, I decided to confront her head-on. "Sophie," I said as we sat at the breakfast table, "I need to know the truth." Are you seeing someone else? She looked at me, her expression carefully blank. Mark, we've been through this. I'm not doing anything wrong. Why can't you just trust me? Because you've given me every reason not to, I shot back, my voice rising. Do you have any idea what this is doing to me? To us? I'm trying, Sophie. I'm doing everything I can to be the husband you need, but it feels like it's never enough. Her face softened, and for a moment, I thought I'd broken through to her. I know you're trying, Mark, she said quietly, and I appreciate it. But you have to understand, my job puts me in situations that aren't always traditional. I love you, but my world is different from yours. It's not fair to compare. Not fair? I repeated, my voice shaking. What's not fair is me sitting here, wondering every day if my wife is going to come home, or if she's going to leave me for the next guy who makes her feel alive. I can't live like this, Sophie. She didn't respond. Instead, she got up from the table, grabbed her purse, and said, I need some air. And just like that, she was gone. When Sophie walked out that morning, I didn't chase her. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at her empty chair, trying to make sense of everything. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that amplifies the chaos in your head. I felt a mix of anger, sadness, and something else I couldn't quite name, maybe resignation. Deep down, I knew I couldn't keep living like this, but the thought of losing her completely felt unbearable. The rest of the day was a blur. I went to the shop, worked on bikes, and tried to focus on the customers who came in, but my mind was elsewhere. Every time the door opened, I half expected Sophie to walk in, to tell me she was sorry, that she wanted to fix things. But she didn't. That night, lying in bed alone, I started replaying the past 3 years in my head. All the times I'd caught her, all the times she'd promised to change, and all the times I'd forgiven her because I thought love was enough. But was it? I loved Sophie more than anything, but loving her had become a kind of self-destruction. Every time I forgave her, I lost a little more of myself. I'd stopped going out with friends because I didn't want to answer questions about where Sophie was. I'd poured all my energy into trying to prove I was enough for her, but it was never enough. No matter what I did, she always found someone else to fill the void she said I couldn't. I felt like a ghost in my own marriage, present but invisible, always watching from the sidelines, while Sophie lived a life that didn't include me. A week after our fight, I was sitting on the couch, flipping through channels when I saw her. Sophie. On TV. It was an entertainment news segment, one of those glossy shows that covers celebrity gossip and industry events. They were talking about a high-profile fashion show in Paris, and there she was, walking the runway, looking radiant as ever. But she wasn't alone. The camera panned to a man sitting in the front row, clapping enthusiastically as she walked. The host's voiceover said his name. It was the same designer she'd been talking to at that rooftop party. The man I'd asked her about. The one she said was nothing to worry about. As the camera lingered on him, Sophie walked off the runway and leaned down to hug him. It wasn't just a professional gesture. It was intimate, the kind of thing you don't do with someone who's just a colleague. My stomach twisted as I watched. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the fact that she wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. She'd moved on to a new man, and there I was, sitting alone in our house, still trying to make sense of it all. I turned off the TV and sat in the dark, the weight of everything crashing down on me. I felt like a fool. I'd spent years forgiving her, making excuses for her, trying to fix something that was broken beyond repair. And for what? So she could humiliate me again and again? I wanted to be angry, to scream, to break something. But all I felt was sadness. Sadness for the man I used to be, the man who believed in love and loyalty and the promise of forever. sadness for the life we could have had if Sophie had been willing to fight for it with me. But most of all, sadness for the realization that I didn't know who I was anymore without her. The days after Sophie left felt like living in a vacuum. The house was quieter than ever, and the routines I'd clung to for years felt hollow. The truth was, I didn't know how to live without her. Even with all the pain, the betrayals, and the lies, Sophie had been my world. Every decision I'd made, every ounce of effort I'd put into my life was tied to her in some way. Without her, I felt untethered, like a ship drifting aimlessly in an open sea. I thought I was strong, that I could move on. But the truth was, I wasn't. I realized just how dependent I'd become on Sophie. Not just emotionally, but in the way I saw myself. My identity was wrapped up in being her husband, in being the guy who loved her no matter what. Now that she was gone, I didn't know who I was anymore. Sophie left for another city shortly after our last conversation. She said she needed space, time to figure out who she was and what she wanted. She didn't ask for a divorce, but she didn't make any promises about coming back either. "Let's just take some time apart," she said before walking out the door. "Maybe this is what we both need." Our relationship was paused, for lack of a better word. She didn't block me or cut off contact entirely. We still texted occasionally, short, polite messages that felt more like updates than real conversations. She'd tell me about her new apartment, her new projects, the places she was exploring. And I'd respond with updates about the shop or the kids, trying to sound normal, even though I felt anything but. The hardest part was knowing she wasn't alone. I saw glimpses of her new life on social media, photos of her at events, smiling with people I didn't know, looking radiant and happy. There were no pictures of another man, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else had already taken my place. Despite everything, I couldn't let go. I kept telling myself that if I could just get to her, if I could just talk to her face to face, I could make her see that we were worth saving, that I was worth saving. I started thinking about packing up and moving to her city, leaving the shop behind and starting fresh. But every time I thought about it, doubt crept in. Would it even matter to her if I showed up? Would she see it as a grand gesture or just another desperate attempt to hold on to something that was already gone? And what would I do if she rejected me again? I wasn't sure I could handle that kind of pain a second time. So here I am asking for advice. I know it sounds pathetic, but I don't know what else to do. I've spent so many years loving Sophie, forgiving her, and trying to prove myself to her that I don't know how to be without her. Even after everything, I still want her. I want to believe that we can fix this, that she'll see how much I love her and come back to me. But I'm also scared. Scared that I'm chasing something that doesn't exist anymore, that I'm holding on to a version of Sophie that only exists in my memories. I don't want to keep hurting myself, but I also don't want to give up on her. What would you do if you were me? Should I follow her, fight for our marriage one last time? Or is it time to let go, even if I don't know how to live without her? I'd appreciate any advice you have because, honestly, I'm lost.